Good morning. It is Friday, February the 11th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have no free lunch and damn Yankees. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. Ineffable Creator, who out of the treasures of thy wisdom has appointed 3 hierarchies of angels and set them in admirable order high above the heavens, and has disposed the divers portion of the universe in such marvelous array. Thou who art called the true source of light and supereminent principle of wisdom, be pleased to cast a beam of thy radiance upon the darkness of my mind and dispel me from the double darkness of sin and ignorance in which I have been born. Thou who makest eloquent the tongues of little children, fashion my words and pour upon my lips the grace of thy benediction. Grant me penetration to understand, capacity to retain, method and facility in study, subtlety in interpretation, and abundant grace of expression. Order the beginning, direct the progress, and perfect the achievement of my work. Thou who art true God and man, and livest and reignest forever and ever. Amen. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for February 11th. I break the curse of death spoken against America. Just as I gave the promised land to my children of Israel, so I gave America to your descendants because of their faithfulness and desire to worship me. But just as I placed a curse on the land of Israel when my children disobeyed me and failed to live according to my covenant with them, so a curse of death will rest on your land for your disobedience to me. If you will turn back to me, humble yourselves, and turn from your wicked ways, then I will forgive your sins and heal your land. Those who place their hope in me will inherit the land and will live in peace. You are my sheep, I am your God, and I will take care of you. 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14, Psalm 37, verse 3 and verse 9, Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 25 through 31. Prayer declaration. Father, we humble ourselves and pray that you will forgive our wicked ways. Forgive our sins and heal our land, O God. And you save us, and your fearsome deeds answer our prayers for justice. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for February the 11th. Thank you, thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is the person that has the courage of his convictions and is confident in what he knows. He is the person that understands that cultural conservatism is more important than political conservatism. He is not selfish, but minds his own business. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He expresses what he knows and does so with certainty. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American, and he's better than the socialist. He's a better friend, father, brother, family member, and a better person, period. You have to know that. If you don't know with every fiber of your being that being a true conservative is best, then you're wasting your time. Thank you, and now there's no free lunch. We can never at one and the same time question all traditional values. Such absolute doubt could lead only to the destruction of our civilization and, in view of the numbers to which economic progress has allowed the human race to grow, to extreme misery and starvation. Complete abandonment of all traditional values is, of course, impossible. It would make man incapable of acting. F.A. Hayek. Human action flows out of the value systems. Those who hold traditional values in disdain have every right to put the burden of legitimacy on those who hold them, but human action throughout history has led to greater growth and less misery. Those who would dismiss the traditions and values that have accompanied human action throughout civilization carry a burden themselves, accounting for what value system will replace that which we dismiss without wreaking havoc on civilization. It's a tall order. And as an aside here, where the author is wrong, is where he says they have every right to put the burden of legitimacy on those who hold traditional values. No, they don't. It's the opposite. The burden of proof is always on those who want change, because it is always possible to prove a positive. By asking people who don't want to change to bear the burden of proof is to ask them to prove a negative, and that's impossible. And that was, there's no free lunch. Thank you. And now, damn Yankees. An early flag of the American Revolution displayed a coiled rattlesnake and the fierce motto, "Don't tread on me," to symbolize the country's fierce determination to rule itself. 200 years later, the animal with the best claim to represent the American character was not the rattler, but a small freshwater fish, the snail darter. The snail darter owes this distinction not to any merit of its own, but to the intricacies of pork barrel politics in the state of Tennessee. During its first 35 years in the dam building business, the Tennessee Valley Authority had more or less ignored the Republican voting hilly upcountry of eastern Tennessee. But the state was trending Republican. And in 1970, the TVA produced a plan for a dam on the Little Tennessee River near Knoxville to be called Tellico, after an ancient Indian settlement nearby. Everything was going smoothly. Then, in the summer of 1973, a naturalist named David Etnier discovered a previously unknown species of perch in the Little Tennessee's waters. The fish might not have been much to look at, but it had a sure sense of timing. Had it been found even 18 months earlier, the TVA would have annihilated its home without so much as a backward glance. But in 1973, Congress had enacted the Endangered Species Act, which prohibited spending any federal money on any project that might extinguish a species of animal. Construction of the Tellico Dam was halted, and the snail darter became the central figure in a complex nexus of regulation, legislation, and litigation that went all the way to the Supreme Court. President Carter had to personally broker a compromise that relocated the snail darters to new homes. A dam originally proposed for the Marines waded ashore at Da Nang at last opened its gates 9 days after Iranian militants seized the American hostages in Tehran. That's an interval 3 times as long as it took Depression America to build the gigantic Hoover Dam in Bleak, Nevada, an impressive achievement for a little fish, especially since it had never really been endangered at all. In the summer of 1984, naturalists discovered snail darters in 2 other southeastern rivers. Snail darters dam busting was far from unique. Its tastier cousin, the Hudson River striped bass, delayed a freeway for almost a quarter of a century. In December of 1973, the weight of a heavy truck caused a 60-foot section of the elevated West Side Highway over Manhattan's Hudson River waterfront to collapse. Fortunately, nobody was seriously hurt, but the accident convinced the city that the much-hated First World War vintage road needed to be replaced. The section of the road below 59th Street was demolished, and planning began in earnest for construction of the up-to-date federally funded interstate highway along the Hudson that Governor Rockefeller had begun calling for in the mid-1960s. After 4 years of wrangling, the new road, Westway, was given what was supposed to have been its final approval in March 1975 by Governor Hugh Carey and Mayor Abe Beame. After a further 6 years of environmental, structural, and traffic studies, the final permits were issued in the summer of 1981. Back in a minute. Thank you. Then the bass bit. Westway was to have been built upon landfill just like the East Side's FDR Drive. In early 1982, a federal judge, Thomas Griesa, ordered the project halted because the Army Corps of Engineers had not adequately considered the impact of the landfill upon the bass. If 15 years of study was not enough, it was hard to know how much would be. But the Corps dutifully trundled off for 3 more years of assessments. In 1985, the Army returned with the news that, at the very worst, no more than 1/3 of the bass in the lower Hudson were at risk. But Judge Griesa was unimpressed and ordered the Corps to start all over again. The message was unmistakable. In 1986, the city and state surrendered and returned the federal highway money. After 10 more years of wrangling, the city began work on a much more modest boulevard. Who says the pace of life is accelerating? In all, New York's new West Side Road will have taken 35 years from planning to opening. Half a century before, the George Washington Bridge over the Hudson had been built in 39 months. Mid-century American government had been organized in such a way as to get things done, to fight wars, build colossal public works, regulate giant industries, stabilize the economy. Looking back on the accomplishments of those years, modern-day Americans must feel like a 70-year-old former athlete browsing through his college scrapbooks. Did we really spend the equivalent of $500 billion a year on foreign aid during the Marshall Plan? Did it only take us 8 years from start to finish to land a man on the moon? Did urban school systems really manage to deliver a perfectly adequate education to hundreds of thousands of slum dwellers? How? And then another thought follows almost instantly. What is wrong with us that we can no longer do this now? The last important addition to New York City's transportation system, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, opened in 1964. The city's most recent attempt to modernize itself by opening a direct rail link from Manhattan to John F. Kennedy Airport collapsed in humiliating failure. The train to the plane will terminate in Jamaica, Queens instead. Nor is this dilatoriness a uniquely East Coast problem. Los Angeles International Airport did not manage to build a single new runway between 1970 and 2000, despite repeated tries. Before succumbing too completely to nostalgia, think of this. The energy and effectiveness of mid-century government was far from the normal state of affairs in the United States. For almost all of the century and a quarter from the Declaration of Independence to the accession of Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency, American government, federal, state, and local, was notorious for its incapacity. By 1900, Imperial Germany had a modest welfare state, and Britain had a functioning income tax and a professional civil service. America, meanwhile, was run by a patronage hacks on an agricultural schedule. Most of the country's paper money was issued by privately owned banks. These banks frequently miscalculated how much money was needed, triggering financial panics at regular intervals. In 1893, in 1907, and again in 1913. When a recession struck, the federal government could not even count the unemployed, much less aid them. Late 19th century American cities were filthy and mismanaged compared to English, Dutch, or German cities of similar size. their roads and ports a mess. James Bryce, who served as a British ambassador to the United States in the 1880s, observed when he got home, "No impression regarding American politics is more generally diffused in Europe than that contained in the question which the traveler who has returned from the United States becomes so weary of being asked. Isn't everybody corrupt there?" Beginning in the 1880s, reformers began inveighing against the feebleness and venality of America's governments, a feebleness and venality that they did not hesitate to blame on the defects of the Constitution. In 1885, the young Woodrow Wilson complained in the first and less tactful edition of his book, Congressional Government, the Constitution was adopted when it was 6 days hard traveling from New York to Boston, when to cross the East River was to venture a perilous voyage, when men were thankful for weekly mails, when the extent of the country's commerce was reckoned not in millions, but in thousands of dollars, when the country knew few cities and had but begun manufactures, when Indians were pressing upon near frontiers, when there were no telegraph lines, no monster corporations. To adapt, the Constitution either had to be formally amended or else wrested to strange and as yet unimagined uses. Back in a minute. Thank you. The great spasm of political reform we call progressivism was an attempt to do that wresting. The publication of Wilson's book is as good a date as any for the movement's intellectual beginnings. 1913, the year of the first income tax and the creation of the Federal Reserve, and the ratification of the constitutional amendment providing for the direct election of senators was its climax. The New Deal was its apotheosis. People we lumped together as progressives disagreed with each other about almost everything. Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt both accepted the designation progressive. Roosevelt ran as a candidate of the party of that name in the 1912 election, and yet hated each other as heartily as any two rival politicians in American history. But almost all progressives were inspired by the same conviction that the country's institutions had failed to keep pace with the times. Too much power, they said, lay in the hands of politicians accountable only to small slices of the electorate. Aldermen rather than mayors, state legislators rather than governors, congressmen rather than presidents. The new nationalism, Roosevelt said in a 1910 speech, puts the national need before the sectional or personal advantage. It is impatient of the utter confusion that results from local legislatures attempting to treat national issues as local issues. It is still more impatient of the impotence that springs from the overdivision of governmental powers, the impotence that makes it possible for local selfishness or for legal cunning, hired by wealthy special interests to bring national activities to a deadlock. This new nationalism regards the executive power as the steward of the public welfare. It demands of the judiciary that it shall be interested primarily in human welfare rather than in property, just as it demands that the representative body shall represent all people rather than any one class or section of the people. Progressives worried that too much of the routine work of government was being done by elected officials, worried about the next election. As the progressives saw it, the big decisions ought to be made by leaders elected in ways that give them a mandate strong enough to crush the objections of entrenched interests, while the routine tasks of administration were executed not by small-time Pauls, but by a professional civil service chosen for its expertise and protected from political interference. This defense of concentrated political power and professional administration was a new thing in American intellectual life. The Constitution had artfully separated the powers of government with an eye to protecting entrenched interests from the whims of temporary majorities. On the rare occasions that strong personalities like Andrew Jackson seized political power in the name of a national majority, 19th century Americans recoiled in fright. Jackson's vigorous, even brutal presidency united his opposition in a new political party, the Whigs, who agreed only that the dangerous powers of the presidency should be curtailed. The Whigs took their name from the British political party that had insisted that Parliament, not the monarch, should rule. The Whigs won few elections, but their ideas prevailed. For the 3/4 of a century after Jackson, virtually no president, not even the strongest of them all, Abraham Lincoln, regarded it as his role to propose legislation. The president could advocate the broad general ideas about public policy, but actually drafting laws, that was Congress's job. The presidents of the 20th century did not accept such modest roles. And from Theodore Roosevelt to Lyndon Johnson, the story of the presidency is a story of steadily expanding power. Even the most unambitious man in the series, Warren Harding, contributed to the president's own enlargement. He created the Bureau of the Budget and thus became the first president to assert a role in determining overall federal expenditures. The progressives' distaste for legislators and small-scale politics has provoked some later critics to accuse them of contempt for democracy. The progressives, however, believed that they were enhancing the power of the vote by concentrating decision-making in the hands of a few highly visible elected officials. Since we began by talking about dams and rivers, perhaps an aquatic metaphor would help illuminate the difference between progressivism and what went before. Think of political power as a flowing water. The framers of the 1787 Constitution keenly perceived water's potential dangerousness. They worried about floods and whirlpools and torrential rain. The system of political hydraulics they designed was intended to ensure that water was collected in discrete small ponds where it would never harm anyone. This same system of hydraulics, however, equally prevented the water of power from generating any substantial benefit. And not only were these minute pools of water unusable, the smaller of them had a nasty tendency to become brackish and polluted. The progressives wished for a system of political hydraulics that gathered water within gigantic reservoirs under the control of a few visible and accountable leaders whose core of expert underlings would then sluice it to irrigate the deserts and power the motors of industry. Perhaps some intuitive appreciation of this aquatic metaphor explains why so many of the 20th century's modernizers seized on dams and hydroelectric power as the symbols of progress. And no mid-century American responded more heartily to the allure of water power than Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. reverently describes the visit President-elect Roosevelt paid to the federally owned Muscle Shoals Dam in northern Alabama in January 1933. The Republicans had wanted to sell the dam. Roosevelt watched as thousands of gallons of water, white and turbulent, plunged through the spillways. Now, at last, the rushing water might light homes, turn wheels, replenish the Tennessee Valley. In a few days, seated before the little White House at Warm Springs, he unfolded before a group of newspaper reporters a broad vision of multi-purpose development throughout the Tennessee Valley, linking water power, flood control, forestry conservation, reclamation, agriculture, and industry in one vast experiment. I think, he said, the development will be the forerunner of similar projects in other parts of the country, such as in the watersheds of the Ohio, Missouri, and Arkansas River, and the Columbia River in the Northwest. A vast experiment in central direction and control, all of it intended to develop the country and uplift the common man. It was a vision to make the pulse race. Once set in motion, however, the experiment quickly revealed some disturbing side effects. Those giant projects often turned out to be excessively costly and environmentally ruinous. Perhaps the single most notorious example was the flooding of Glen Canyon in southern Utah. Glen Canyon on the Colorado River was regarded by naturalists as second in its awesome beauty only to the Grand Canyon itself. But the waters of the Colorado were coveted by farmers and hydroelectric utilities, and in 1956, Congress authorized the construction of a great dam just below the Glen Canyon. The Colorado's flow was stopped, and the backed-up river waters inundated the canyon, transforming it into today's Lake Powell. The loss of the canyon galvanized what was then still called the conservation movement, which began to raise haunting questions about the laws that gave the Reclamation Bureau the power to proceed with its pet projects, heedless of all opposition. Back in a minute. Thank you. You can't fight city halls was the bitter lesson of the conservation fights of the 1950s and 60s, and nobody taught that lesson more brutally than Robert Moses, the master builder of New York, who controlled the commissions responsible for state and city parks, highways, bridges, and public housing from the days of Herbert Hoover to those of Richard Nixon. Governor Rockefeller finally forced Moses out at the end of the 60s, and in 1974, Robert Caro published a searing indictment of the man's career, The Power Broker. Caro's painstakingly researched and elegantly written book deservedly soared onto the bestseller lists, but has suffered from a strange internal contradiction in its argument. Moses was a man willing to smash eggs to make an omelet. Caro's post-war generation grew up amidst great mounds of Moses' shattered eggshells and decided that the shards were beginning to stink. The trouble was that while liberal-minded people in Caro's generation disapproved of egg smashing, they still enjoyed the omelets. Caro did not object to Moses' trampling on the property rights of Long Island's great estate owners to build parkways to the New York State parks, but he was horrified by Moses' trampling on the occupancy rights of South Bronx tenement dwellers to build the Cross Bronx Expressway. To reconcile these two conflicting emotions, Caro proposed a distinction between the good early Moses, who wanted to serve the people, and a bad late Moses driven mad by his own lust for power. And this distinction was not very convincing. There was only one Moses, and he was the same man when he brushed aside the arrogance of the rich as when he shrugged off the pleas of the poor. Moses' progressivism, he was a Theodore Roosevelt bull mooser till the end, postulated the existence of a general good larger than the interests of any single class. If the general good called for parks, too bad for the selfish rich. If it called for expressways through the slums, too bad for the inconveniently domiciled poor. And who got to define this general good? Cynics will say Moses himself. But Moses could wield his power only because he was the appointed agent of representatives of the political majority. The progressives are often derided as snooty elitists, but the truth is that they greatly increase the number of decisions made on the principle of majority rule. That is fine so long as you are in sympathy with the majority, as liberal-minded people generally were in the 1930s. It is not so fine when you find yourself in the minority, as liberal people so often did in the later 1960s and 1970s. 30 years of economic progress has transmuted the labor farmer Roosevelt majorities into the rural suburban Nixon majorities, and this shift in American politics is the ultimate source of the foaming rage that gripped so many of the era's liberal-minded writers as they contemplated their fellow citizens. Re-entering America after a trip abroad, observed the writer of The Pursuit of Loneliness, a much-quoted 1970 book, one is struck first by all of the grim monotony of American facial expressions, hard, surly, and bitter, and by the aura of deprivation that informs them. In The Greasing of America, Charles Reich could barely contain himself on the subject of blue-collar white people and their sullen boredom, their unchanging routines, their minds closed to new ideas and new feelings, their bodies slumped in front of television to watch the ball game Sunday. In her 1962 attack on Moses' style, Urban Planning, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, Jane Jacobs tells a story about a Greenwich Village bakery that gives a wonderfully revealing glimpse of the post-progressive liberal political idea. The bakery was located on a low-rise street of small shops and apartments. One day, it filed with the city planning department an application to expand its operations. The residents objected, but they faced a quandary. The surest way to stop the bakery under the prevailing zoning rules was to have the street zoned residential. This could easily have been done, but it would also have put the street's small shops, which the neighbors liked, out of business. Jacobs argued from this little parable that what New York needed was zoning not by use, residential, commercial, industrial, but by scale. Some things were just too big for some places. Jacobs proposed that each block in the vast metropolis of New York be governed by its unique set of rules about how big a use could be. This scheme could require more than 50 sets of zoning rules simply to govern the small section of Greenwich Village that lies between 6th and 7th Avenues from Waverly Place to West Houston Street. But Jacobs had an answer for that. Cities should be divided into self-governing zoning districts, none larger than about 1.5 miles square, and most of them smaller. In 1898, progressives had merged the 5 boroughs of New York into one city because they regarded Manhattan and Brooklyn as inefficiently small. Jacobs regarded even the boroughs as monstrously large. This 1.5 mile standard would imply at least 9 district planning authorities simply for that fraction of Manhattan Island south of Central Park. Each of those authorities would be governed not by some so-called expert appointed by the mayor, but democratically, ideally by a kind of legislature of 200 elected representatives from smaller organizations and street neighborhoods. Think of it, 1,800 planning legislators south of 59th Street, charged with writing a unique set of rules for every single city block. Another 1,800 more above, then Brooklyn, then Queens, then the Bronx, then Staten Island. Jacobs and people like her were driven to such absurd extremes because while they begrudged the old progressive means, they still willed the old progressive ends: political control of private economic activity. Jacobs found the idea of letting Manhattan grow freely as repugnant as Robert Moses ever had. She wanted its growth controlled, but controlled by neighborhood activists like herself rather than the bureaucrats and engineers unto whom Moses had delivered the city. Jacobs was a utopian, but utopians sometimes get their way. Through the 1970s, political power in the United States was transferred in exactly the way Jacobs had hoped for. Even her pet project of municipal district government was realized. The Lindsay administration acquiesced in the division of New York City into community boards that gave an opportunity for activist citizens to comment on, criticize, and even halt real estate developments. State and federal courts, which had traditionally refused to let third parties intervene in lawsuits, took a welcoming new attitude toward lawyers who claimed to represent the public interest. Federal and state regulatory agencies opened their doors to a much broader public. With a bit of political luck, activists could do better still. In Jimmy Carter's Washington and Jerry Brown's California, radicals who in 1971 had been struggling to gain a hearing were, by 1977, holding the gavel. Back in a minute. Thank you. In 1980, Lloyd Cutler, a Washington lawyer and advisor to Democratic presidents, published a much-cited article warning that America was becoming ungovernable. Presidents from FDR through Nixon had commanded the deference of Congress, but Congress was splitting up into factions beyond the control of any leader. Even the executive branch had spun out of presidential control as an iron triangle of bureaucrats, tiny congressional subcommittees, and interest groups had made the real decisions. Carter had come to office intending to create a vast, comprehensive system of federal energy controls. Instead, he was forced grumblingly to accept gradual deregulation. Carter's top international priority had been a grand arms control deal with the Soviets. Threatened with certain defeat in the Senate, he had to withdraw his SALT II treaty and preside instead over an arms buildup. Carter was, up to a point, a victim of his own incompetence. During an August 1980 interview, Dan Rather of CBS asked Carter, "Mr. President, you recently directed your staff to make report cards on their employees. Now, in specific areas, I'm going to ask you to grade yourself A through F. Foreign policy." Carter's reply, "You put me on the spot. I would say maybe B or C plus. Let's say B minus. Overall domestic policy. Under the circumstances, I think about a B, maybe a C. And on leadership, maybe a B. Honest enough, but dumb." But it was also true that by 1980, the president's policy-making power had badly corroded. The collapse of party discipline in Congress crippled his ability to get legislation passed, and tightening judicial scrutiny made it harder for him to act by executive order. What Cutler failed to perceive, however, was that the power ebbing out of the presidency was not being lost. It was dissipating. The United States was not ungovernable. It was, rather, being governed by new institutions in new ways and for the benefit of new interests. And that was Damn Yankees from the book How We Got Here, the 70s, the decade that for better or worse gave us modern life. Thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that seeks consensus. He is subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He's informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He's impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He's deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He's skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, reminding you to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.